It's Friday night. You're single and ready to mingle. You've decided you're going to put on a fire outfit, get a little tipsy, and go on the prowl. It's been a minute since you've gotten some action, so tonight you're going to make yourself available. You meet up with your friends for the pregame, and all of a sudden, a little tipsy ends up turning into full on hammered. 2 hours later, you're at the bar dancing your face off. Fast forward 8 hours, you wake up with some rando in your bed. So, what the hell just happened? Welcome to Stone Cold Moderation, a thinking man's journey toward a healthier relationship with alcohol. I'm your host, Chase Lee. Let's continue with our discussion. We've all gotten a little too drunk and made some mistakes. Am I right? Some of us have gotten a little too drunk and kissed someone we shouldn't have. And some of us have gotten a little too drunk and woken up next to some rando. It happens. Alcohol is a disinhibitor. So the common conception is that drinking makes you more willing to engage in risky sex. At the party, you drink to loosen up a bit, right? Good old Dutch courage. Yet, the motivation to drink is a complex issue with various psychological factors at play. And, as Dr. Lynne Cooper will soon explain, alcohol consumption itself might not lead directly to risky sex, so much as it might be a means to justify that end. Okay, so before we get to the main event, this episode we are going to be talking about alcohol consumption and risky sex. I did receive a late entry related to the topic of last episode, which was discussing what is the best way to start. Is it better to go cold turkey or to taper off your drinking gradually? And I received an expert testimony from Taylor Parrish, who is based out of the US. He is a mental health advocate and a sobriety advocate when he's not doing his day job, which is as an entrepreneur. And he owns his own interior design brand. So this is Taylor Parrish, and these are his thoughts.
Quitting cold turkey for me was the only option that I had. I feel as if you're really going to take recovery seriously, quitting cold turkey is what you have to do, because gradually declining your consumption of alcohol, to me, is a way to justify your intake. And it's an excuse, is the way I saw it. I would justify my intake all of the time. I would say, well, tomorrow I'll have 3 glasses of wine instead of 5. Well, it would end up being 7. It was never the number that I would predict it to be or want it to be. And that's why quitting cold turkey was the only thing that would work for me. My drinking started progressively about 7 years ago, and it was a very progressive process over time. I moved to Atlanta, and the city was new, the people were new, my job was new, and I was also a full-time student at Georgia State University getting my major, and I had double minored as well. So there was a lot going on, especially in my personal life, and trying to balance that with my career and school and all of these different things was a lot to juggle. I felt like because everybody else was doing it and drinking, that if I was getting everything I needed to get done accomplished, then it was okay. So the way that I looked at it was, well, if I don't drink one day, that means I'm not an alcoholic because alcoholics drink every day, right? So in my eyes, I justified it that way. Well, over the 7 years, things got worse and worse. I moved to Scottsdale, Arizona in 2017, and I figured moving out west and away from the East Coast would be an opportunity for me to restart and really get my life together. Well, this backfired on me, and things actually ended up getting worse. Everything that had bothered me in my life or had been traumatic was catching up with me and at a quicker and quicker pace. I realized that you can't run from the things that have been traumatic in your life. The only way to really get through them is to unpack them in a healthy manner. And the way that I was doing that was by drinking. I did a really good job of putting on a face. I was known as the happy go lucky, fun person to be around in the office, out of the office, on the weekends, and everyone gravitated towards that energy. And it became a lot because I never knew what it felt like to be comfortable in my own skin. I always molded to others, and I really struggled with finding my own identity. And that's why I hid behind alcohol, because it helped me be comfortable with who I was. And without it, I didn't feel like I was anything of value. I didn't know how to be of value or of service to others because all of my time outside of work was spent in a bar or drinking at home or on a patio somewhere. So quitting cold turkey was the only way that I was going to get better. And that's when I decided to go to treatment. And I did about 12 weeks. I did 28 days at an inpatient program. And then I went to a drop down PHP program, which stands for Partial Hospitalization Program, where I spent 6 weeks in Levittown, Pennsylvania. And now I'm currently in an outpatient program, which I will continue to be in for the next couple of weeks. And then I'll be working with a DBT specialist therefore after and for a long time. But quitting cold turkey, if you're really serious about recovery, is the best way to really get the ball going. Gradually declining consumption, to me, always ended up back at the same place where it started. And quitting cold turkey has, at the end of the day, been the best decision that I could have ever made for myself. And now I, I hardly look back. It can be challenging from time to time, but overall, I'm in a much better space. And I'm glad that I quit cold turkey instead of gradually declining my consumption.
All right, just a quick reflection on Taylor's comments. First and foremost, congratulations to him on his recent recovery, and a big thanks for sharing his story and speaking about his recent treatment as well. That's very heavy stuff. So congratulations for that, and thank you for sharing again. A couple of things that stood out to me. I think one thing that stood out is the difference between kind of surviving and thriving, like he kind of illustrated. He was talking about when he was in school, how he was getting everything done, right? He was working very hard, he was studying very hard, drinking heavily on the weekends. And since everybody else was kind of doing that around him, that was kind of enough. And that was acceptable, right? But it's so much better, and I think Taylor would agree, to be in a space where you are not only just surviving and putting all this effort into just getting through the day, and then putting all this effort and energy into kind of convincing yourself and others that you're okay, right? Which takes a lot of energy and can really be damaging as well. Just that effort that it takes to do that, and thriving when you're at your physical and mental best, which I'm sure now he would say that he is at, or much closer to it. Um, yeah. So the contrast between surviving and thriving, for me, yeah, just thinking about where I was like a year ago, year and a half ago, when I was kind of doing the same thing. I was working extremely, extremely hard, kind of completely overwhelmed with work, and then kind of covering up and putting all of these metaphorical band-aids on, the emotional mess that I was putting myself into every weekend when I was drinking. And just the difference between me then and me now, it's striking. His story and his comments also got me thinking a lot about willpower, just how much improvement and change, both immediate and long term, we are capable of making and sustaining when we really put our minds to doing something and we really demand better from ourselves. I mean, he was talking about juggling so much in life, personal, professional, and then medical in this case as well. And just how much we're capable of taking on. And when we decide to make certain changes, how drastic of an improvement we can quickly make in our lives. I hope that makes sense. Yeah. So what I want to do, I want to again commend him for his recovery. Thank you for your thoughts. And yeah, let us move on to the next thing. All right, so moving on. A few episodes ago, I had on Dr. Lynne Cooper to discuss drinking motives. We discussed that topic in great detail, and today I will be sharing the second part of our conversation. We'll be talking about alcohol consumption and risky sex. So grateful and lucky to have on Dr. Cooper, who, over her lengthy career, whose research focused broadly on issues of risk-taking and adjustment, particularly among adolescents and young adults. So here was our conversation. Okay, so excited to have Dr. Lynne Cooper back on the show today. Lynne, how are you?
Good, thank you. How about you, Chase?
Doing okay, thank you. So today we're talking about everyone's favorite, which is drinking and risky sexual behavior. And you are an expert in these studies. So you sent me an article of yours, which you wrote. How old is this article? The Does Drinking Promote Risky Sexual Behavior?
I don't know when it was published. Probably it's probably about 10 or 12 years old now.
Okay.
It was a review paper. So it was a review of kind of what was known at the time.
Right.
And, just in terms of situating that in terms of current knowledge, I would say that there are, of course, new findings that have been added, many new findings that have been added to the literature. But the basic ideas that are laid out in that article are still pretty much the prevailing ideas in the literature.
Gotcha.
So.
Yeah, so this was an article that is from a journal called Current Directions in Psychological Science, and the title is Does Drinking Promote Risky Sexual Behavior? So we're going to be talking about that today. So studies that you've done have shown, in this article, have shown that people who drink on a consistent basis report having more sexual partners than those who abstain. That's clear in what the research shows. And most, I guess, would assume a causal relationship between the two, right? So I guess, people who, when you drink, it makes you more likely to have sex, and the drinking itself causes the more sex to happen. But you assert that that's not necessarily the case, correct?
Right. Yeah. It turns out, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. Mm-hmm. There was a really old saying in the literature that how does it go? It's called the assumption of malevolence. And that is that if alcohol is involved, it must have a negative effect, right? So it's sort of like if something bad's going on, blame alcohol. That's a convenient excuse, right? But in fact, it is a lot more complicated than that, because we know that while it is true, at this global level, that people who in general have more sexual partners also in general drink more, right? But that doesn't mean that the occasions when they're having sex with all these different partners that they're necessarily drinking, right? There's no link, temporal link in those data between those two experiences. But like you say, people do tend to jump to the conclusion that that alcohol is causing, the increase or the greater number of sexual partners. But it's, the classic statement applies there that, correlation is not causation. And that, of course, is a correlation between these two different types of behaviors. So it could be, and this is sort of what I outlined in the article, is that there's really three alternative explanations for that association that we see in the data, which is a very reliable, very robust association. Okay, so the first one is the most complicated one, the one that our mind jumps to more or less automatically, is that alcohol does lead to increases in sexual behavior. And I think we can go into why even that link, when it is true, is a lot more complicated than most people think. Okay, a lot more conditional or contingent, whether or not drinking will actually lead to more sexual behavior or riskier sexual behavior, as most people assume. So let's talk about how the complications that apply even to that causal relationship in a minute. And for now, just kind of go through the three different explanations that I think are important for people to consider. So one is the one that people's mind jump to, which is the causal link between alcohol and sexual behavior, with alcohol being the cause and sexual behavior being the consequence. A second is that some underlying third variable causes both behaviors. So for example, when we say there's this consistent association between people who drink more also having more sexual partners, it could just be that people who drink more and people who have more sexual partners are different from people who drink less and have fewer sexual partners, right? And that it's those differences that really cause both of those behaviors, not that those behaviors have any causal association with each other. So for example, people who have poor impulse control maybe will have more sexual partners and drink more. People who, are high on excitement seeking, we talked about that as a factor that promotes drinking. Well, that could also be a factor that promotes having a lot of different partners, right? People who are high on excitement seeking maybe get more bored more easily, with the same partner, so have lots of different partners. So there are lots of ways in which the people who drink a lot and have a lot of partners might differ from people who don't drink as much and have fewer partners that could cause both behaviors. So that's a really powerful counter explanation. And what we know about that is that if you look at the literature, that both of those behaviors have many correlates in common that are potential candidates, third variable candidates, right, that might explain that covariation between these two behaviors. We also know that for some of those potential correlates, like poor self-regulation or poor impulse control, that controlling for, if you have a study where you measure both of those behaviors and you measure, let's say, poor impulse control, and you control statistically for that the association that we observe in the data between drinking and sexual behavior actually gets weaker. It may not necessarily go away entirely, but it definitely gets weaker, suggesting that at least some of that association is due to third variable causes, just differences, in a personality or predisposition, differences between the people who are low on both behaviors and people who are high on both behaviors. So that's a really important explanation to keep in mind. That doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with alcohol causing, right?
Yeah, and
sexual behavior.
Yeah, and that's go ahead.
Well, and then the third possibility is what I've talked about or called the reverse causal possibility, right? And that is that while we tend to think of alcohol causing sexual behavior, it's also possible that that people who want to engage in certain kinds of behavior may drink in order to facilitate that experience, right? And this certainly goes to the idea or the role of expectancies, right? So people believe that drinking makes them, let's say, that it facilitates sexual experience. You know, they believe they're more casual, they're more smooth, they're more bold. You know, whatever kinds of behaviors or characteristics that might make them more effective at, you know, convincing somebody to go to bed with them, or, you know, might make them more likely to say yes to a potential, you know, overture from somebody. They may, in fact, to the extent that they want to do this anyway, right, might drink in order to make that happen. And in that case, it's really hard to argue that the alcohol is causing, right, the sexual experience. It's more like the desire to have the sexual experience is causing the drinking, you know, and the drinking is kind of epiphenomenal in a way. I mean, it's clearly playing a role. It's playing an important role, but it's misleading. I think it's oversimplifying to say it's causing the, you know, the sexual experience per se, because the person is using it strategically in order to facilitate something that they're, you know, trying to make happen anyway, right?
Yeah, and that's very interesting to say it simply, right? That because that's not something that you really hear about or think about so much when you are drinking, right? The fact that people already, you know, people already have the intention to have sex, but it's not the alcohol that necessarily does it. Like, my question is there a way to measure like which is more of a factor or more important of a factor? Is it like the intention that precedes the drinking, the intention to have sex, or is it the disinhibition caused by the alcohol itself? Is there a way to know which one is like more significant, or am I kind of posing that question incorrectly?
No, I think that's a really, really interesting question, Chase. And it kind of goes to the heart of how hard it is to, from a scientific point of view, to try to unravel these explanations, right? Because you can go into a laboratory where you have control, right? You can randomly assign people so that you can eliminate differences between the people who are drinking and the people that aren't drinking. And you can look at what happens, right, in different scenarios. Let's say, you know, a lot of the studies that have been done, when you can't obviously allow people or set up a study where people actually have sex, right? Yeah. That's not going to fly from an ethics point of view. But you can set up a study where you give people alcohol or not, and you can also control, you know, you can use what's called a balanced placebo design. A balanced placebo. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah, you're probably going to need to explain that.
Okay. So what a balanced placebo design is it's a 2x2 design where basically some people get a placebo drink, and they know it's a placebo drink, right? Oh, okay. And then some people get a placebo drink, but they think it's alcohol. And there are really clever ways that they've developed to convince people that they're actually drinking alcohol when they're not. And then there is a condition in which people get alcohol, but they think they're getting a placebo. Mm-hmm. And then there's the condition that approximates actual drinking, which is where they get alcohol and they think they're drinking alcohol, mm-hmm. right? So that's what occurs in a naturalistic situation. So you're in a sense in a naturalistic situation, you're confounding the alcohol content effects, what are the pharmacological effects with the expectancy effects. Oops, sorry.
Okay.
And then the other naturalistic condition is the condition where they don't get alcohol and they don't think they're getting alcohol, right? But that design allows you to disentangle the pharmacological effects of alcohol from the expectancy effects of alcohol, right? Because you've got a condition where people believe they're getting it, but they're not, and a condition where they're getting it, but they don't believe they're getting it,
Gotcha.
right? So it's a really interesting design. But in any event, you can take in a laboratory and you can disentangle expectancy and pharmacological effects. You can just compare naturalistic drinking to not drinking, but the beauty is that degree of control, that you have the control to separate out those kinds of effects, and you have the control to determine that the groups of people who are drinking and the groups of people who aren't drinking and the groups in all the conditions are statistically equivalent, right? And if you have a large enough sample, they will, in fact, almost always be really equivalent on the things that matter. Okay. Small samples, you can have differences between groups that can give rise to misleading findings just by accident. But in any event, you have a level of control that allows you to tease these things apart so that you can actually look at, we know a lot about what alcohol's, both the pharmacological effects and the expectancy effects can be from the laboratory studies. So we can learn a lot about alcohol's causal effects or potential causal effects, because what we don't know is in the wild, as we say, in natural settings, to what extent those results actually, or those findings and those links, those effects observed in laboratory, to what extent they necessarily generalize to real world settings where there's a lot more going on and the signal isn't so clear as it is in a laboratory, right? And certainly, like I said, in the real world, it's hardly ever the case that expectancy and pharmacological effects don't co-occur. You either get them both together or you don't get them at all, right? Because people drink and they know they're drinking most of the time.
Right.
There are weird situations that might occur occasionally, I suppose, with people slipping, somebody alcohol when they're not thinking they're drinking it, or, who knows. But in any event, mostly they go together, right? You drink it and you're drinking it. But in any event, so we have a lot of data from laboratory things that can really address, at least what alcohol is capable of doing causally. And there we can make pretty clear causal inferences because of the level of control we have. But once you move to a real world setting, it's really, really hard to disentangle those different things. And I think the truth is that we have a lot of evidence that all three of those causal processes are operating. So when we see just this sort of global association between these data, the fact that we started with, which is a very robust finding, that on average, people who drink more also have more sexual partners, that we can pretty much, I think all the evidence suggests that global association reflects this sort of big tangle of different causes, right? It's not due to a single cause. It's partly because people who drink and people who have a lot of sex partners are different from those who don't drink or have many sex partners. It's partly that alcohol causes, people, that alcohol does have a causal effect on your sexual experience. And it's partly, this other thing that we talked about, which is, the idea that people use alcohol in a sense, either to try to make something happen they want to have happen, or another way they can use it is to provide an excuse, right? So they can say, yeah, I really want to go out. I want to meet some guy, and I want to get laid tonight or whatever. I don't know how you guys say it these days. That's the way people say it when I was young, And so they get, and happens, I think, not necessarily at a totally conscious level, but I think if, you want to do something that you're feeling like you probably really shouldn't do, or it's maybe not the smartest thing to do, or maybe you feel a little guilty about that, but you want to do it anyway. Drinking can provide an excuse, both to others and to yourself after the fact, right? You can go, oh, I was drunk. It doesn't mean anything. It was stupid, but I was drunk. So you can both let yourself off the hook, and you can use it as an excuse, a face-saving excuse or whatever to other people. So I think that's another kind of a nuance, right, around that idea of the reverse causal association, that it's not really necessarily the alcohol, right? It's this intention or desire that's really driving, in a sense, both behaviors, right? So it's an interesting twist, I think. But I think it's very real, but it's pretty hard to study. And the main way you could study something like that is by using a diary study, where you enroll people to provide information repeatedly over a number of days, and so if they're gonna go out drinking, you might, have them complete really short questionnaires, let's say in the morning about what happened the evening before, and in the late afternoon or early evening before they, go out or start to drink or whatever, about kind of what's on their mind, what are they planning to do, and so on. And so you could maybe tease it out in that kind of design where you have these repeated assessments over time, right? But again, it gets it's very tricky, and the idea of what you're talking about is really apportioning variance and saying this much of this relationship is due to this process, this much is due to this process, this much is due to this process. So then you could say, oh, this process is the most important one. That's very hard to do, and it's also sample dependent, right? So how much each of those different processes operate may vary across types of samples, right? So, it may be, and I mean in the most general sense. So it could be that it would vary across men and women, it would vary across age groups, but it would also vary as a function of, let's say, people with different drinking careers or sexual careers, right? So I think answering that question, I think it's a question that's really intrigued me a lot, and I've thought a lot about how to try to answer it. And I think that the bottom line is that you would never get a definitive answer to that question, because it would really depend on so many parameters. The other thing I just want to mention before we move on to that question is we've been talking about we've been, in a sense, mixing two levels of analysis here, because the other thing, so we've talked about these three different types of causal processes. We talked about alcohol causes sex, or the intention or desire to have sex maybe causes the drinking, and then some third variable causes both, right? Mm-hmm. But you can also think about that as having a both a short-term horizon, a temporal horizon, and a long-term horizon. Right? So there are processes that unfold in real time over minutes or hours, like you drink, you are feeling the acute effects of alcohol, and, you act on some sexual impulse or opportunity and you have sex. But there's also, if you think about it, there's a long-term unfolding that happens too, right? If you are drinking a lot, let's say as an adolescent, and maybe that's, leading you to engage in certain kinds of behaviors or avoid other kinds of activities. Let's say, maybe you're skipping classes, maybe you're, doing XYZ, maybe you're falling in with certain groups, and over time that leads to certain kinds of exposures, right? So that could over time also have this longer term effect that, again, is not linked at the occasion level. So it's not an acute causal effect of alcohol, right? Because for alcohol to have an acute causal effect, a drink, what's the half-life of the, like you have a drink and you feel tipsy or whatever for, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, and then the effects start to wear off, right? And you're on the downside of the blood alcohol curve. Those are acute effects, but there are long-term chronic effects that have to do with lifestyle issues that, maybe that have to do with selective exposures or different kinds of exposures because you fall in with the group that drinks a lot, or because you're drinking a lot and you're skipping a lot of classes. And so it has all of these effects that play out over a much longer temporal horizon too. And they can be causal effects, or they can be reverse causal effects, or they can be, sort of third variable kinds of effects. So if you think about it, and I'm very visual, so I think about it, in terms of research design, almost as like a 2x3 design. You've got sort of acute effects, and you've got long-term or chronic effects, and then you've got these three different causal processes, right, that could operate on this short-term horizon, or that could operate on this long-term horizon. So when we talk about this overall association between drinking and sexual behavior, and like what are all the processes that contribute to that, it's a really big mass of causal processes. It's at least these 6 different classes of causal processes that operate both in the short term and over time. So it's, I think it's really helpful to think about it at that level of complexity, but it's not easy to parse it out.
Yeah, because it seems like pretty simple, right? Like alcohol and sex, they go together, right? They go together kind of in like, I guess, in pop culture and kind of what you observe in your life and whatnot. But yeah, it's an incredibly, as you point out in your research, it's an incredibly complex question. And yeah, I think the idea that you talk about that, like the intention and the desire to have sex, can precede the actual alcohol use, and that it might not be the alcohol, it might be, the personality traits of the person, or what group they kind of belong to, or, their life experience that can lead to, that can actually be like the main cause of them wanting to have sex, not the alcohol. That's pretty fascinating for me. So I did want to ask, like, what are the groups that you have found that are more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior due to drinking? Because my first thought was, like 20, like young, like fraternity dudes and people in college, and like young 20 something, well, at least in the US.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's also a really interesting question, and I think the answer to it is not. I don't know how straightforward it is. I mean, I do know that there are some basic demographic trends that are well established, right? We know that there's this really very robust phenomenon that shows that people, both men and women, or girls and boys, young men, young women, because we're talking about, let's say, behavior between the ages of about 13 and 25, okay? So that adolescent young adult period, that there's a very clear arc to engaging in risk behavior over that time. And it peaks at about maybe 18, 19, and then it kind of goes down and it levels off around maybe 25, okay? So it's going up through adolescence to late adolescence, and then it kind of asymptotes around the early years of college, and then it goes down. But the exact shape of that arc and what the high point and the low points are, and how peaked it is or how flat it is, differs across a lot of different demographic groups. So, for example, men drink more than women, and that's true across that entire range of ages, right? whites drink more than blacks or Hispanics, and that's true across that entire age range. Well, we've already talked about that is age, so that's not exactly linear, but if you're looking at an adolescent sample, drinking goes up throughout adolescence, it just does. And so does sexual behavior. So sexual behavior and all other kinds of risk-taking, whether you're talking about, mild forms of delinquent behavior, whether you're talking about, other marijuana use or other kinds of drug use, they follow a pretty similar pattern, right? So that, they increase throughout adolescence, they kind of asymptote, and then they eventually kind of taper off towards around 25 or something. That's the general pattern. So age is a really important determinant, of what both the involvement in both of those behaviors look like. And so is race, with whites drinking more in general. So is sex, with men or males drinking more than females. So I guess those are the really big demographics. Well, the other demographic that is really a powerful determinant of alcohol use is people who go to college drink more than people who don't. I think there's something that, with just the way that your life both, sorry, I don't know, I moved my phone away. Both the, I think it's norms, it's partly norms, it's just, that it's a very heavy drinking subculture. But also I think there are some structural things about, the way you have, it's not like having a 9-to-5 job, where you have to get up every morning and you have to go to work and, do this kind of thing, which is the alternative that people who don't go to college typically, go into the workforce. And we have evidence that these shifts, that these role shifts, that shifting into going into the workforce is associated with decreases in alcohol use. Obviously getting married is associated with, decreases in alcohol use. So there are these role changes that are also really important. So when you think about groups, I think that's how most people think about it, are these sort of demographic groups, or social role kinds of groups. And there's a lot of evidence to show that alcohol use differs across all those groups in really reliable ways, and they're pretty big effects. Sexual behavior follows some of those same patterns. Certainly, the number of partners that just a metric like that does follow that same curve, that age curve I talked about. Where it increases throughout adolescence, kind of asymptotes, and then declines. But for example, and it's the same for the sex differences. Men have more sexual partners than women at every age. That's pretty clear. The race, though, is interesting because while whites drink more than blacks in general have more sexual partners than whites. So that's not a case where those two trends sort of they flip, in terms of those demographic patterns. So it's complicated. But the thing I really wanted to say about it, so we can think about it at a group level, but what I think is more interesting is to think about it in terms of, I mentioned earlier that it's a much more complicated relationship than most people think, because there are all these different reasons and causal processes that might be at work, although people tend to just go automatically to this belief or this assumption that drinking leads to, more sexual experience or better sexual experience. But in fact, the research on that is much more complicated, and that gets to, I think, the next question you wanted to ask me about, which was alcohol myopia theory.
Yeah.
So could we talk about that?
Yeah.
A little. Okay.
Yeah, no, yeah. I was going to ask you because we already talked about expectancy theory last time, but we didn't
Mhm.
talk about it in this context of drinking and risky sex. So I wanted to ask you how expectancy theory kind of relates to alcohol myopia theory. And first of all, what is alcohol myopia theory?
Okay. Well, those are a lot of questions, so we'll
Yeah.
see if we can take them one at a time. You
Okay.
might have to remind me
Okay.
if I forget. Okay, so alcohol myopia theory is a theory developed by a man named Claude Steele, who is now at Stanford. And Claude basically had this very clever idea, I think, that, I mean, we know that alcohol interferes with cognitive processing, right? That when we are drinking, our ability to process information is diminished, basically. We can't, track as many different sources of incoming information, and we don't process it as efficiently, we don't process it as thoroughly as when we are not drinking. So that is a property of a pharmacological effect of alcohol, that it interferes with cognitive processing. And that's something we can study and has been studied in the lab. So we know that's a causal effect of alcohol. So the idea behind alcohol myopia theory, I think it's a really interesting, very elegant theory. It explains a lot of alcohol effects. But the idea is simply that because our ability to process incoming information is impaired, we tend to process in a more superficial way only those streams of information that are really salient at that time and place. So it's kind of like what's in the forefront of your mind, or in the forefront of even your visual field. You can manipulate this by just like making a cue, a particular kind of signal, more salient, right? So basically what the theory says is that because our cognitive processing abilities are diminished, we tend to focus on only those cues that are really salient, kind of really in your face. We still detect them, we perceive them, we process them, but what we don't process that we would normally tend to process if we weren't impaired cognitively, we would also process more distal cues that are more subtle, that are in the background. And so, in fact, if you think about that, so you're still processing incoming information, but you're only processing kind of let's say that normally a behavior might be controlled by 10 different cues, and some of them are like cues that say, oh yes, you should definitely do this, or this is a very attractive option. And some of them are cues that are going, oh, wait a minute, maybe you really shouldn't do that, because if you do that, you might have this kind of negative outcome or whatever. And for many behaviors and the kinds of behaviors where we think people have limited ability to process incoming cues that would normally govern their behavior, and that they're going to just take in the cues that are really salient and not process what are called more peripheral cues, that often are cues that would make you think twice about doing something, okay, that might actually lead you to reconsider. So you respond to these immediate cues that lead you to, in theory, engage in a behavior that you wouldn't otherwise engage in if you weren't inebriated, right? So that's a general model. And most of the time, given the cues that govern situations where your immediate cues are things that lead you to want to engage in a behavior, and the more peripheral cues are things that make you second guess that, and so kind of step back and go, wait a minute, maybe that's not such a good idea. So that in that situation, your limited cognitive processing leads you to engage in riskier behaviors that you wouldn't maybe always engage in. But if you think about it, the whole model, so that process could operate, but the effect would depend entirely on what that particular combination of salient and peripheral cues governing a behavior is, right? So if the salient cues are cues that prompt cautious behavior, and the peripheral cues are cues that prompt more risky behavior, then in fact, drinking in certain circumstances could actually lead you to be more cautious. And so it's kind of flips everything we think about alcohol on its head. And I think that's because we come to hold the beliefs that we have about alcohol based on experience. And in most cases, the cues that govern behavior promote risky, the salient cues promote, are about attractiveness of things or desirability of things, and lead us to follow those cues and ignore the more like the longer term risk, let's say, of engaging in this attractive behavior. So we've come to believe that alcohol sort of disinhibits behavior. That's where that idea sort of comes from. But in fact, it's a reflection of the sort of, in our actual experience, that most behaviors have that particular configuration of, cues that govern them. But like I said, in laboratory settings where you could, for example, manipulate behaviors so that the salient cues are more risk avoidant cues and the peripheral cues are risk promoting cues, you can show that alcohol actually leads people to behave more cautiously.
What's Yeah, just a question. What's an example of like the kind of cues you're talking about? Like, is it could it be, for example, I don't know, like seeing somebody and you think they're attractive and you want to go talk to them and potentially, meet that person? Like, is that what you're like being attracted to someone? Is that an example of a cue or what?
Yes, that
Okay.
would be an example of a cue. Let's say you meet somebody in a bar and they're attractive and they're appealing to your ego, and they're saying nice things about you, and so on. Those would all be cues that would promote, that would encourage you to continue to pursue that and to engage, maybe, to have sex, to make sexual overture, or if you were the recipient of the overture, to say yes to the overture, right? So those are cues that would promote risk in that setting, right?
Wow.
Whereas the more peripheral cues, the things you're not thinking about while you're sitting on that bar stool next to this attractive person, are like, oh, I didn't bring any condoms. I left them in my room tonight, and maybe this isn't a really good idea, right? Because those are more, they're not front and center in your attentional field, right? So it really has to do with kind of what is front and center in your attentional field and what is sort of out of mind, out of sight, right? And so the idea is, right, if alcohol makes you less able to process the full range of cues, you're just going to focus on what's sort of in your face, right?
Gotcha.
And you're not going to be thinking about, because you really don't have the cognitive capacity to like retrieve all these other things and, sort of weight them all rationally, because it's a lot of cognitive energy and abilities that really alcohol limits your ability to do that kind of stuff, right? But so in lab settings, they've done things where, for example, they might manipulate the salience of different kinds of cues. So if you're like setting up a scenario where, like a scenario like we were just talking about, you're in a bar or whatever. Oh, did I lose you again?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, okay.
I was pulling up the camera.
Um,
Sorry.
yeah. So like there was a really cool field study actually where they did this, where in bars they put I think it was something like they put up all these signs all over the bars reminding people like AIDS kills or something like this, some kind of, like a real downer in a bar, right? But
Yeah.
but
To try to get
anyway,
people to drink less or something. I don't know.
but what they found though was that people that they had, I think, some like a big goldfish bowl full of like I kind of, I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact details of this study, but anyway, they were able by manipulating these signs. So they had control signs, they had, different kinds of signs. They were able to show that people were actually more likely to take, condoms out of these bowls. And I mean, they didn't follow them home and see what they actually did, but they were able to show that people actually engaged in what appeared to be more cautious behaviors when drinking, depending on how salient the cues were, right? So about risk. And in laboratory settings, they've been able to do it in even more controlled ways than in these field settings, right, in a bar. But there is clear evidence, both, it's consistent with the theoretical model, and there have been some studies where they've been able to manipulate the what we call cues, to make cues promoting risk-averse behaviors more salient and the ones promoting risky behaviors more peripheral, and they actually show that alcohol can lead to more cautious behavior.
Huh.
So it's much more complicated than we think in general. So even when we're talking about the fact that alcohol can have a causal effect on sexual behavior, it doesn't necessarily always have that effect. So it depends partly on the situation, and what cues are salient in the situation, but it also depends on the person's psyche, right? So if you are a person, let's say, in one study I did, it was a really interesting study where we looked at drinking, the effects of drinking on first dates, and we had collected these data over several years, and so we had people tell us about multiple first date experiences, and we had data from both male and female partners, and we looked at whether or not they had sex on that first date experience and whether or not they'd been drinking or using other drugs and how intoxicated they were on that date. And so these were, retrospective reports after the date, they recounted this information. And what we found is that when men drank on first dates, the probability of intercourse was significantly higher than when the man didn't drink. But when the woman drank on first dates, the probability of intercourse was actually a little lower. And so it kind of flies in the face of this idea, because some people do think that if they ply their partner with alcohol, men have reported trying to ply their partners with alcohol because that would increase the likelihood of having sex. But in fact, that's not really what we found. Now, that doesn't mean if you get your partner completely shit-faced that you may not increase the likelihood of having sex, because maybe she can't even provide legitimate consent at that point, right? But, so we're talking about more moderate levels of consumption in general. But what we were able to kind of tease apart in that situation is that it seemed to go back to the different cues that govern sexual the decision to have sex with somebody for the first time for men and women. And for men, most of the things that they reported to us all had to do with benefits, right? So mostly they saw benefits and very few cost, but women saw mostly cost and very few benefits. So in fact, following along the thinking of the alcohol myopia theory, for men drinking, just because the benefits were first and foremost in their mind, were kind of had held stronger sway over their behavior or their decision making when they were drinking than when they weren't, because those were the dominant cues governing behavior, right? Because they're mostly, that's what they saw when they thought about the, you know, when they thought about making that decision, was this would be a good thing or bad thing. They're like, well, mostly it's like it's all about benefits, right? But for women, it wasn't. For women, it was mostly all about cost. And so when they were drinking, those costs were actually more front and center, and it was harder for them to access or process these more peripheral cues, which had to do with benefits, right? So,
Wow.
So in fact, that was an interesting example in a real world setting of how, you know, the effects of alcohol aren't as straightforward as we think, and they can actually be opposite of what I think people commonly believe about its effects.
Wow. Blew my mind with that one. Um, so I guess the moral of the story is when you go on a first date, like, don't try to get the girl really drunk. Thank you. Wow. No,
No,
because
I did qualify that though, because I said if you get them
yeah.
really drunk so that they can't really give consent,
Oh
well,
God.
that's a different story.
That's a whole different story.
And that's a whole different story, and not a road you want to go down anyway.
No, of course not. Yeah, but no, but yeah, like you said, like that completely flies in the face of what you would, I guess, what the common conception would be. Yeah, that's, and just to be clear, like I guess the benefit that like the man would perceive in this situation could be, for example, just like, oh, like he gets to have sex, and that's awesome. And the cost might be like, I guess, like, I don't know, like potentially like feeling regret the next day, or the fact that it might be unsafe. Is that kind of okay?
Exactly. Those are the kinds of things we had, sort of cost and benefits in different categories. You know, social benefits might be that, oh, you know, it's something you can brag about to your friends or tell your friends about, or even if you don't engage in that kind of behavior, you could sort of, it's a notch, you know, it's a conquest, or it's a positive in your own psyche, right? You know, it's like, that's cool. You know, I'm pretty good at this. Or it's a, you know, it's a physical benefit. It like feels good, right? Or, you know, it's a kind of social benefit where you're like, well, you know, I really like this person, and, you know, maybe this would lead to something positive, you know. So there's a whole range of possible benefits, right? From the momentary, you know, physical benefits to different kinds of social benefits. So those are the kinds of things we measured on the benefit side. And on the cost side, you know, social costs, as you mentioned, or personal costs like feeling guilty or something afterwards, or, you know, the kind of cost related to, you know, for a woman getting pregnant, or for either man or woman getting, you know, some kind of a disease related to it. So like I said, for women, all those costs were more front and center than the benefits were, but for men it was the complete reverse.
And why is that? Is that like the pharmacological effect of alcohol having different effects on men and women, or am I kind of lost
No,
there?
I think that's entirely social construction. You know,
Okay,
it's the reality of being a man or a woman
gotcha.
in most cultures, you know, that make that that array of benefits and costs differentially salient. I think that's a social phenomenon by and large. The alcohol process is the same. I mean,
Right.
that's what's really interesting about it, right? The underlying process is the same for men and women. It's just that the social milieu is completely different, and it, you know, results in a completely different set of, you know, costs and benefits, and the differential weight they take on for men and women. That's all socially constructed, I think.
Oh, well, that
But
is,
so that's
yeah.
why answering your question about group differences is really hard to answer, because, right? Because the social construction that it's culturally determined, it's socially determined, like different groups have different perspectives on men and women's roles, different perspectives on, you know, the appropriateness of, let's say, having sex before marriage, if that's a good thing or a bad thing or acceptable thing or an unacceptable thing. So when you talk about alcohol's effects on sexual behavior and which groups are most likely to, have sex affect, to be affected or to have a strong link between drinking and sexual behavior, it really starts when you start thinking about what that underlying causal process is. It becomes very difficult to answer that question, right? Because it's very much, we're talking about a phenomenology, right? Something that happens at the individual level. But there are group differences in those norms, right, that affect how a person is going to perceive these, let's say, cost and benefits is one simple way to think about these sort of competing factors that are governing decisions about behaviors, right? Gotcha. So to the extent that the norms differ within different subgroups, to the extent that, people are really have incorporated or absorbed those group norms versus, some people can be a member of a group, but not maybe be, fully embedded in that group, but they could be more, not have accepted that group's norms and so on. So just because they're a member of a group doesn't mean that's automatically their individual experience is going to perfectly mirror the norms that exist in the group, right? But in any event, it's really hard, I think, to answer the questions about which groups, because ultimately it comes down to a kind of this individual psychology, I think, is really how it plays out. But it is true that there are, on average, group differences. So there are some group differences, but that's, I think, the more useful way to think about it. I was like, why do these group differences exist? And it has a lot to do with these cultural norms around, sexual behavior and gender differences and appropriate behaviors for men and women and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that is all very, very fascinating, to say the least. And
so this was not the answer you were expecting.
No, definitely not. And I didn't get, because I think I was reading your article and I didn't really understand exactly what that was like saying in plain terms. In terms of, like we talked, like in terms of like men and women and the first date scenario that you talked about. That's wow. Yeah, that's very, very thought provoking now. Anyways, yeah. The last thing I wanted to ask you about, we were talking earlier about a recent article that you published, and yeah. So I forget exactly what the subject was, but you thought it might fit well in
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, this is an interesting study because, again, we asked people to tell us about multiple sexual experiences they'd had. So over a number of years, we repeatedly assessed them and asked them about recent sexual experiences. And then in each of those cases, we asked them about whether they'd been drinking alcohol and so on. And this was part of a longitudinal study, which I think I mentioned the last time, how I followed these people from the time they were basically from 13 through 30. So I have multiple assessments of, sexual experiences across time. And, we had assessed on multiple occasions their beliefs about the effects of alcohol on a lot of things, but among those things on sexual experience, whether it enhanced sexual experience, whether it disinhibited sexual experience, and whether it promoted riskier sexual experience. But the really interesting findings from this study, so the basic question we were trying to answer was whether or not people who believed that alcohol enhanced sexual experience or disinhibited sexual experience would drink more on sexual occasions, and whether when they drank on these sexual occasions, that belief became true, that in fact it did enhance their experience or not, right? So those are kinds of the two questions we wanted to ask. And so what we found was that, yes, it was true that people who believed that alcohol promoted positive sexual experience, that had a beneficial effect on the quality of sexual experience, were more likely to drink when they had sex, and they drank more than people who didn't hold those beliefs, right? So people were acting on those beliefs in a sense, right? So they're going like, well, I'm going to enjoy this more if I'm drinking. So, I'm going to drink, before, during, whatever, this, when I have sex. So that's very logical. It makes sense, right? So that's a case where your expectancy that drinking will make an experience better leads you to drink in that situation. Makes perfect sense. What was really interesting about it, though, is that then when we looked at, based on their reports of how enjoyable the experience was that in fact they didn't enjoy the experiences more when they were drinking. They enjoyed it significantly less. And this is because we had repeated occasions, right, where we asked them about their drinking and their sexual experience. We could look at within person and we could say the same person on the occasions where he or she drank reported lower levels of satisfaction, lower levels of positive emotion, and higher levels of negative affect when they were drinking than when they weren't. So this is a within person comparison, not across people, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So that's a really powerful test, right? Because then you're ruling out differences between people in accounting for that effect. Because we're talking about a comparison of the same person across multiple occasions. Sometimes they drank when they had sex, sometimes they didn't. And on those occasions, that same person reported less positive experience when they were drinking than when they weren't. Okay, so then we said, well, the third question is, okay, so maybe if we just look at the people who believe that alcohol makes experience better, maybe for them it does make it better, right? So we basically tested what's called an interaction. We looked at, people who don't hold that belief so much, and whether or not when they drank, their experience was worse when they drank, but and better when they didn't, but they didn't believe anyway that it was going to improve things, right? So we looked at it sort of separately for the people who didn't hold that belief and the people who did hold that belief. And in fact, the results were the same. Even people who believed that drinking would make sex better, they too reported that it was a worse experience, that they felt less positive emotion, more negative emotion. They were less satisfied when they were drinking and having sex than when they weren't. So it was just a really interesting set of findings, about, so a lot of people believe that drinking promotes positive sexual experience, but from what we can tell, it is not true. So it's really interesting. I mean, one question is like, well, why does this belief persist? If in fact, in your own experience, it's not generally true. And I mean, I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's a really interesting question. And I think one possibility has to do with advertising, and just kind of the power of advertising in popular culture. I mean, there have been a lot of studies just like doing like thematic analyses of ads and thematic analyses of scenes in movies and things like that. And, alcohol is always shown as being, associated with, very sexy women and, with suave behavior. And, I mean, not always, but on average, it's portrayed in this very positive light and as having, being associated with sexual conquest and, all that kind of stuff. So maybe that's why, but I think it's a really interesting question when in fact the data don't suggest that, that people actually really experience a benefit from drinking, a sexual benefit. So
yeah, And it reminds me of this quote from Shakespeare, Macbeth, and he says that alcohol provokes the desire, but it takes
Mm-hmm,
away the performance,
mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm,
that's I've been thinking about that as you
mm-hmm,
were speaking about that
mm-hmm,
study because he
mm-hmm,
was partly right,
mm-hmm.
I guess.
Well, and that absolutely, but that applies more to men than women.
Mm, right.
And B, there's also a curvilinear effect of alcohol on sexual performance, right? And so a little bit may, in fact, it doesn't have negative effects up to a certain point,
Mm,
right? On actual tumescence, So so that's what he was talking about, I think. And obviously, if you drink too much, then that's totally true.
yeah.
But yeah, so I don't know. It's a much more complicated relationship than I think the way people think about it is very simplistic compared to the reality of it.
Yeah. And I
And
think
it's not like we have all the answers by a long shot. It's so complicated. There's a lot, lot that nobody knows. But from what we do know, it appears like it's a lot more complicated than most people think.
all right. First and foremost, massive thank you to Dr. Lynne Cooper for her time and sharing her wealth of knowledge with us. Just a quick reflection on that conversation. I think what really stood out to me was her talking about the study that she conducted related to drinking and sex on first dates, and the findings that suggested that, well, at least in the case of women, women might be less likely to have sex on a first date if they drank, right? Which is not what you would think. That kind of goes against our common conception of what alcohol can lead to in those situations. Um, and I guess that whole idea struck a chord with me, um, because I've definitely noticed in myself that in certain situations, maybe I'm at a bar, I'm at a party, not on a first date, but at a party in a social situation, and I've this happened to me many times in my life where I've gotten too drunk or I've been drunk to the point where maybe I was talking to somebody and vibing with somebody, connecting with somebody, but I got too drunk and I got distracted, and I don't know. Instead of maybe pursuing that that opportunity with that person, I just got lost in the drunkenness and I was off taking shots and I don't know, and I got distracted by talking to other people or something like that. And then the next day was like, well, shit, like what the fuck happened? Like, why didn't I not pursue that? Not to say that the only point of going out is to hook up and meet somebody. Um, but no, I mean that's happened to me several times. And this idea that alcohol can actually inhibit some of the psychological cues that that would otherwise lead to sex, I found that pretty interesting. I'm not sure if my experiences fit in perfectly with that model, but I found that very thought provoking. Okay, so wrapping it up. Also reflecting on this interview, this idea of blaming it on the alcohol, right? We've all heard people say it. It's like kind of a saying in pop culture, right? Not just pop culture, just our culture, right? You went out, you met somebody, you got drunk, you blame it on the alcohol, whatever. Kind of BS though, right? Because based on at least Dr. Cooper's findings, it isn't the alcohol that necessarily in itself that causes the risky sex to happen. Somebody who goes out and gets drunk and then sleeps with somebody, maybe, possibly, very likely, already had it in their mind that they wanted to do that. And it was the alcohol that kind of maybe disinhibited them a little bit towards doing that, but they had it kind of planned out in their mind to already do that. So, is blaming it on the alcohol BS? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. But definitely some thought-provoking stuff. German-American author Charles Bukowski once wrote, "That's the problem with drinking," I thought, as I poured myself a drink. If something bad happens, you drink in an attempt to forget. If something good happens, you drink in order to celebrate. And if nothing happens, you drink in order to make something happen. This has been the Stone Cold Moderation Podcast with Chase Lee. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check out the complete show notes of this episode on stonecoldmoderation.com, where you can learn more about us. For access to more content, please subscribe to our YouTube channels and check us out on all other social media platforms.